better aligns workplace rights and the immigration regime. So here would be the requirements for the temporary transnational labor visa. The first thing would be, it would sever the link between a visa and an employer. That link is the most deadly to workplace rights of any link in immigration law. So sever the link between an employer and a visa, and those workers are free to move between employers just like any other worker. The workers come in with full labor rights and this free mobility, so long as they do one thing. And really, it's really two things. Essentially, it would be three things. It sounds better if I say just one thing. They would need to make a promise on which the visa would depend. And that promise would be not to take a job that an employer tried to give them at lower than basic workplace standards, and to report any employer who tried to either hire them or once hired to treat them in a way that violated the law. They wouldn't have to bring a case against the employer, they wouldn't even have to be a witness, but they would have to report the employer and move on. The reason, that's the one requirement. But I think of as less of a requirement than as the support for this. The idea that workers on this transnational labor visa would be linked to migrants or workers' organizations in their home country and also in the United States. So they would have support for knowing what their rights were, for defending their rights, for standing up with other workers, whether they were, just like I said, with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, whether they were at home, in the United States working, or in between. And the idea would be that all those efforts would be supported by an advocacy network that included lawyers and government officials and unions and so on in the country where they were working, here in the United States. So the idea, and really the core principle, is to make workers' rights and worker organizing central to the very structure of labor migration. Right now, labor migration is structured in a way that disincentivizes people to stand up for their rights. It incentivizes them to forget about their rights. And transnational labor citizenship is my answer to the question, what would it look like if we had a labor rights system where all the incentives pointed toward standing up for your rights, and also where there was institutional support to reinforce workers' rights and workers' capacity to stand up for those rights. Now, I know a utopia when I see it. I particularly know a utopia when I create it. But in search of some company for my utopian fantasy, I did spend about 5 years after, the past 5 years, after I came up with transnational labor citizenship, looking around the world for examples of things that resemble it. And I found some, dear reader, I found some. I did not actually find many in Mexico and the US, which is where I first was looking for them, in part because Mexico's labor movement is in such a difficult moment, and that would have been a likely partner, although there are new organizations starting up in Mexico that I haven't hoped for yet. I did find them, however, when I looked in Asia, where there are really exciting partnerships between unions in places like the Philippines and Hong Kong, or Nepal and South Korea, tracking migrant flows, where unions on both sides of those flows are together working to organize those migrants so that they can be members of a Nepalese union when they're in Nepal, of a South Korean union when they're in South Korea, and both unions are involved in pushing their governments to negotiate agreements about labor migration that include components of workers' rights. And I have many other examples of that, but I think if I started, I would get too deep in the weeds, so I'll let you ask about that if you want more information. But just to say that idea, the idea that labor migration is better for all workers when the migrants have organizing support in their home countries and in the countries they go to, and where their labor migration is structured around that support, is not a total fantasy, at least outside the United States. So from all this, right, I've ranged pretty far and wide. What is the takeaway from this sort of stream of my consciousness that I've taken you on? Definitely, and this is to repeat because it's so important, we need legal reform in the United States. We need legalization, most of all, and in its absence, we need the removal of immigration law from the workplace. We need to untie guest workers from an employer. We need an enforcement focus on labor rights, not on immigration rights. But ultimately, we need to move toward thinking seriously and grappling with the difficulties of what our future labor migration program is going to be, because there are going to continue to be people who want to come to the United States. And as we think about that, we have to remember that equal rights and full mobility are precursors to decent work. They are not its guarantors. That what we need, even if, God forbid, we achieve more free mobility and more equal rights, we need the institutional support of government enforcement, of unions, of worker centers, and we need an environment in which they can organize and workers can join them freely and they can collaborate so that migrants are able to turn all those rights they have on paper, which, you know, they would only look like so much because they're still unattainable. Once you get there, we can talk about how inadequate those rights really are. And when they can do that, when they can turn rights on paper into reality, we will all be a little bit closer to decent work and therefore to workplace justice. Thank you.
Super exciting. So I might have droned on in closing remarks had that not been so exciting. As it stands, I will not drone on in closing remarks because I think we should have somewhat of a conversation and allow at least some questions for So let's do that. Are you comfortable?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting. You tripled my knowledge of labor law. What happens when this ideal migrant breaks the promise and accepts lower wages or other abuse? Does someone tell them and they get deported? And also, I was wondering, what was someone thinking when they tied migrants to employer sponsors in the first place? Was it taking a pass on them sometime?
Since I fully see the problem with the first question, I'll answer the second question first. I think that the idea behind it originally was that that was going to limit competition with U.S. workers because the employer had to go through a process back then that was much stricter than the process now of showing that it was not able to recruit U.S. workers for that position. And so the idea was if you make the employer show that, then, then that employer has passed, but every other employer hasn't. And I think that was at the root of the historical root of that policy choice. So on the very hard question of, I have this beautiful solidarity sounding regime, and what happens if you actually violate it and, as a worker do accept that job. I have regretfully come to the conclusion that that would have to be what the visa depended on, that that's how you lose the visa, and that means that, another way of saying that more broadly is I've come to the conclusion that if we have an immigration system that's fundamentally fair, which is not at all the system we have now, that you have to be able to have some enforcement within that system. Otherwise, you have de facto open borders. And if you're going to have that, you should just have it for real. I think that if you set up rules that are decently fair, you then have to enforce them.
Yeah. So to draft off that, a two-part question. And what, in your utopian world, do we do with criminal conduct? And I'm curious about that in the context of the EU. Is there such a thing in an open labor market? Is there such a thing as deportation for criminal behavior? And how would that draft into your vision? And also cost. I work for an employer now, and I know the cost of a visa, and it's not insubstantial. And so with the notion of untying it from an employer, all the government administrative burden of processing these workers, how do you vision being able to pay for that?
So your first question was about criminal, the intersection of criminal behavior. I haven't tried, although maybe I have many years left, I haven't tried to reform the whole immigration system, right? I mean, I have my own views. I'll just do it off the cuff right now. My own views, which I'm sure are shared by many of the immigrant advocates in the room, is that we've gone way too far in making deportation a consequence of even the most minor criminal behavior, and that should be rolled back to where it once was, which is for the most heinous crimes you can be deported. But in my conception of transnational labor citizenship, the idea is it doesn't protect you from other immigration violations. It's just an affirmative way to structure labor migration. So that would be a separate piece of reform that had to happen. And then in focusing on that, just remind me of one word, what the other one was? Cost. Oh, cost. Well, actually, what was really interesting to me, after I started, there's the academic article, then I started writing op-eds and speaking publicly about this a couple of years ago. It's actually not unappealing to employer associations because they wouldn't have to bear the cost, right? Right now, employers who sponsor workers, they have to pay to bring them in. This program is, there might be, you could imagine structuring it so employers have to pay some kind of tax to have access to those workers. But it seems to me, and I have gotten some sense from some employers and employer associations that in fact might be a way to tap into the fact that all the big employer associations favor a new temporary worker program, an increase in temporary workers, and have in fact gone so far as to say that they'd be okay with one that didn't link the employer and the worker, and have also said that they think we need one that protects workers' rights. This is a way to say, okay, here's the deal. You get the workers so long as their rights are protected. And as a bonus for you, you don't have to go through that hellish application process. So that's an easier piece, I think, politically.
Thank you very much. I'm curious, in these examples, the foreign examples you gave of Asian countries that have sort of the transnational labor citizenship.
I wouldn't go that far, but right.
How did they come about? Did it come in at a legislative level? Was it a grassroots movement that just set up an organization for the oversight? I mean, where did they start? I did a series of interviews with all of these unions and asked that question. And what most of them said was that they had gotten to know each other, right? The Korean union and the Nepalese union, the Philippine union and the union from Hong Kong, in the context of the international global labor movement. And so, for example, a lot of this action was taking place within what are now called global union federations, used to be called international trade union. Anyway, now they're called GUFs, the unattractive name of GUFs, global union federations. The Building and Woodworkers International is the GUF for the construction industry, and they have been having for a long time in Asia meetings of unions organizing those workers. The issues came up of migrants, right? People in Malaysia, which is a receiving country, were saying, well, migrants are coming into the timber industry and they're lowering wages, and people in Nepal were saying, our migrants are coming from the timber industry and we're getting hurt. And so over time, those conversations, which started out just being about organizing strategy in the individual countries, in the halls over coffee, developed into conversations. And then, and I think this is the key part, because I really think institutional support is absolutely necessary, or none of this will ever happen. Yeah. BWI funded somebody to be their migrant labor coordinator, and they brought them together. BWI paid for them to come together over a series, over a period of time, and develop these programs and support them. And that's really how it never happens by accident. Always through, relationships and then institutional support.
You had mentioned about the guest workers in Louisiana marching all the way to Washington. And I thought that was funny after many years in Louisiana that they, of course, marched to Washington and not to Baton Rouge.
They may have marched to Baton Rouge first and got no response.
And that was my question. Unions are in such an odd state in so much of the South, Louisiana particularly, with the right to work laws.
Yeah.
But really, if you're not a Teamster or you don't work for the state, you can't unionize. Like we used to call it the U word, because if you said it, you got fired. And you could form a union after you were fired, but it didn't really.
The Union of Fired Workers is
So I was wondering who had organized that, if it was like an international group like you were talking about.
No, that one was organized by the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice, and the National Guest Worker Alliance is just one of their projects, but it has an sounding name. They organized the signal workers, and they provided support for them. And then as it became clear that many guest workers wanted their support, and that was happening all around the country, they renamed the project the National Guest Worker Alliance, but it's still part of the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice, which was formed in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and which has the goal of bringing together immigrant workers already here, immigrant workers on guest worker visas, and African American workers in New Orleans, and they have a series of great projects to do things like that. So that was who was behind both of those guest worker efforts. Yeah.
And then this is probably the last question, so we'll have time to chat out there.
Okay.
You talked about the low-skill, low-wage workers and African-American workers being the most affected when the EU opened their borders. And so I'm wondering how you would see that working if, I mean, this probably never happened, but if the United States opened their borders, how you could see maybe coalition building, because I could see a lot of resistance from the workers that are already here, low-wage workers that are already here, and African-American communities.
That's a great question, and just to clarify, the EU, if the findings were just about their low-wage workers, but in the U.S., it's African-American workers where there's the greatest battle, in the low-wage African-American workers, the greatest battle between economists. And the question you ask is what's occupied the other half of my brain that hasn't been occupied with transnational labor citizenship for the past number of years, and a colleague and I have written a series of policy papers as well as academic articles on conflict and solidarity between African American and new Latino immigrant workers, thinking about what underlies what conflict there is and where there's solidarity, as in that Smithfield UFCW organizing campaign, what makes for solidarity, and to answer maybe with the what makes for solidarity part, which is really the answer to your question. It seems one of the really important things so we did case studies of efforts that were successful, bringing the two communities together around labor issues or other issues. And people are always talking about, well, we just have to identify shared interests, right? There's a shared interest and everybody can come together. But there's so much history before you get to the point where two groups of people, even two people, can sit down and identify a shared interest. And one of the things that was really interesting that we found in looking at what had been successful efforts was that all of those efforts had an education and I've lost the word, but I'll come back to it when I describe the education component. The education component was sitting down with new immigrant arrivals and talking about the history of slavery, of racism, of the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the U.S., in the way that that's perpetuated economically, in the difficulty that African Americans have had in moving out of low-wage jobs, right? All the history that people who grew up in the United States should anyway know, but people who come from other countries don't know. And likewise with African Americans, talking about globalization, the reasons people move, why there are illegal workers, why people come undocumented, and the history of the U.S. in relation to many of the countries that people come from, and then having people come together, at least with some knowledge of each other's history, and figure out whether there is some point in common to move forward from. And that is most often successful where there's a clear joint economic interest, as in a situation where all the workers are being equally held down. But so often, language, lack of knowledge, racism, and hostility that comes from not knowing is an impediment to figuring out what that interest is. And then, and this is sort of appropriately my final word, you need institutional support. There is never, ever a moment of a blinding light and magical solidarity that lasts on its own, particularly where it's hard, as it is with immigrant workers and African Americans, where there's a lot of tension, there's racism, there's complicated communication issues. Nothing lasts unless you have institutional support. It's a fantasy to think that solidarity is a magical creature that comes to visit without a lot of work ongoing in support of the workers. So there you go.
Terrific.